Welcome back to the deep dive. We're doing something today that feels a bit like archaeological excavation.
Ooh, I like that comparison.
You know when you see those ruins where they've dug down 10 feet and you realize the modern city is built on top of like 3 other cities that nobody remembers?
Yeah, that is actually a perfect analogy for history. We walk around on the surface, assuming the ground is completely solid,
Right.
but we're actually walking on all these layers of forgotten context.
And today we are digging into perhaps the most unstable, uh, controversial, and deeply misunderstood layer of Western history. We are talking about the Crusades.
Huge topic.
Massive. And this is a big, but we aren't doing the standard high school textbook version here.
No, definitely not.
If I stopped a random person on the street right now, just any of you listening, and asked, how did the Crusades start? What's the answer I'm going to get?
You're going to get the aggressor narrative. It almost always goes something like this. In 1095, for reasons that are either completely inexplicable or purely greedy, a bunch of fanatical European Catholics decided to march a few thousand miles east.
Just out of nowhere.
Right, to unprovokedly attack the peaceful Muslim world, steal their land, and force conversions. That's the standard story.
Right. It's usually framed as this early, clumsy imperialism, or, as I've heard it described before, colonialism in chainmail.
Exactly, colonialism and chainmail. But the source material we are unpacking today, specifically the historical analysis by Raymond Ibrahim and his really extensive work on the military orders, it argues that this narrative is, well, it's intellectually bankrupt.
Strong words.
It is, because it's not just slightly off, it's missing the entire first half of the movie.
And Ibrahim calls this the deliberate vacuum of history.
Yes, it's the vacuum. Think of it this way. If you start the story of the Crusades in 1095, it's exactly like starting the history of World War II on D-Day. Yeah, if you look at the invasion of Normandy without knowing anything about the invasion of Poland or the Blitz or Pearl Harbor, the Allies just look like absolute maniacs storming a beach for no reason whatsoever.
I mean, when you frame it like that, it makes total sense. So our mission today for this deep dive is to fill that vacuum. We are going to thoroughly explore the defensive war hypothesis.
Which is going to surprise a lot of people.
I think so too. We are going to look at the two swords doctrine, which is basically the theological operating system that allowed a religion completely based on turning the other cheek to produce the Knights Templar.
Right, the warrior monks.
And we're going to confront some very uncomfortable realities about the geopolitical map of the Middle Ages, because we need to answer a really fundamental question. How did the medieval mind reconcile killing with salvation?
Because if we don't understand that, we don't understand anything about them. We're just projecting our modern values backward.
Exactly. So let's start with the map. I think this is where the vacuum is most obvious. When you or I think of Christendom, or the Christian world today, or even when we picture it in the Middle Ages, we instinctively think of Europe.
Sure.
We think of those massive cathedrals in France, the Pope in Rome, maybe Canterbury in England.
And that is a total retroactive delusion.
A retroactive delusion. I like that.
It is. That is us taking the present and projecting it right onto the past. If you go back to the before picture, let's say the year 600 AD or right around 632 AD, Europe was absolutely not the center of the Christian world.
Is the backwater.
It was the backwater. It was the little brother of the faith.
So where was the big brother? Where was the actual center of gravity?
The Middle East and North Africa,
Yeah.
what we refer to as the MENA region today. You really have to realize that Christianity at its core is an Eastern religion. It was born in the Levant.
Right.
In the 7th century, the demographic, the intellectual, and the financial heart of the faith was in Syria, Egypt, Palestine, and modern-day Turkey.
I remember reading in the sources that St. Augustine, who is arguably the most important theologian in Western history, outside of the apostles themselves, he wasn't European.
No, not at all. He was African.
Right.
He was from Hippo, which is in modern-day Algeria. The great libraries, the massive theological debates on the nature of Christ, the wealthiest dioceses, they were all in Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople.
Well, Europe was doing what?
Europe at this time was dark, cold, and largely pagan or just barely functionally converted. The Mediterranean Sea wasn't a border, it was a lake. It was this massive superhighway that connected a huge, prosperous Christian civilization.
So what happens then? How do we go from a reality where Syria is the absolute center of Christianity to a reality where Syria is the heart of the Islamic Caliphate.
The Islamic conquests happen, and the source material really goes out of its way to stress the sheer speed of this. It wasn't some slow, gradual cultural drift over centuries. It was a blitzkrieg.
The word the author uses is cataclysmic.
It absolutely was. Muhammad dies in 632 AD. Within just a few decades, we're talking by 636, 642, the armies of Islam have burst out of the Arabian Peninsula.
It's just an explosion of expansion.
Yeah. They shatter the Persian Empire in the east, which had been around forever, and they just hammer the Byzantine Empire in the west.
And the map just bleeds red.
Completely. Syria, gone. Yeah. Egypt, which was literally the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, gone. The entire coast of North Africa, which had been Roman and Christian for 600 or 700 years, gone.
And the source emphasizes this wasn't just a new governor stepping in.
No, this wasn't a change in management. This was the rapid collapse of an entire civilization in those regions.
And it didn't stop at the water's edge either.
Not at all. By 711 AD, which is less than a century after the religion is founded, they cross the Strait of Gibraltar, they conquer Spain.
Moving right into Europe.
They keep going. By 732 AD, they are physically crossing the Pyrenees Mountains.
Which leads right to the Battle of Tours.
Right. Think about that date. 732 AD. Muslim armies are in central France. They are within marching distance of Paris.
That is wild.
This is the existential moment for Europe. Charles Marth, they called him the Hammer. He finally manages to stop them. But you have to think about the psychological shock of all this.
Oh, must have been terrifying.
If you are a Christian living in London or Paris in the 8th century, the world is literally closing in on you. The walls are shrinking.
The source mentions the Venerable Bede here. He's this famous English monk living in Northumbria, which is way up in northern England, right in the early 700s.
Yeah, very far from the front lines.
Exactly. And even he is writing about the Saracens. He knows that they are ravaging Gaul. The fear was absolutely pervasive. It wasn't some abstract problem happening over there. It felt like he was at the door.
And this brings us to a really crucial economic theory that the deep dive sources get into. The Porin thesis.
Right.
This connects the conquest directly to what we call the Dark Ages.
Henri Pirenne, his famous line, which I love, was, "Without Muhammad, there is no Charlemagne."
It's a great quote.
So unpack that for us. Because on the surface, those two historical figures do not seem related at all.
Well, Pirenne's argument is fundamentally about economics and trade. Before the conquests, like we said, the Mediterranean was a Roman lake. Gold, spices, papyrus, oil, everything flowed completely freely from Egypt up to France, from Syria over to Italy.
Global economy of the day?
Exactly. But the conquest turned that peaceful lake into an active war zone. The sea became hostile.
So the trade just stops.
The tap is turned completely off. Europe is suddenly cut off from the wealthy East. And because they can no longer trade by sea, they have to turn inward. They become entirely agrarian.
They have to rely on land, not money or commerce.
Right. And this sudden isolation forces the development of the feudal system.
So you're saying the knights, the castles, the serfs working the land, that whole standard Middle Ages aesthetic, we picture, Pirenne argues this wasn't just some natural cultural evolution.
No, it was a survival mechanism because they were essentially being blockaded.
That is fascinating. Europe literally became a fortress because it was under siege. The poverty and the darkness of the Dark Ages were a direct result of this geopolitical strangulation.
Exactly. It wasn't that they just forgot how to read or build things overnight. They were cut off from the resources that allowed complex society to flourish.
Now, here is where we have to really get into the mindset of the people living through this. How did the average Christian, or the theologians of the 7th and 8th centuries, explain this rapid loss of their world?
That's a great question.
Did they view Islam as a competing theology? Did they sit around and think, oh, here is an interesting new interpretation of Abrahamic monotheism?
No, not at all. That is a very modern, secular perspective. They viewed history exclusively through a metaphysical lens, not a political one.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning, to them, absolutely nothing happens on Earth without God's direct permission. So if these massive foreign armies are sweeping across the known world and destroying ancient churches, it must be because God is angry with them.
They thought it was the apocalypse.
Many of them did, yes. They literally thought these were the armies of the Antichrist bringing about the end of days. Or, at the very least, they viewed it as severe divine punishment.
The chastisement.
Right. There is a specific text from the late 7th century by a writer that historians just called Pseudo-Methodius.
Catchy name. Very memorable.
Yeah. Historians are notoriously bad at naming things. But this text is incredibly revealing. He basically lists all the sins of the Christians that have brought this terrible wrath down upon them.
What kind of sins are we talking about?
He talks about sexual immorality, widespread drunkenness, and oddly specifically, cross-dressing.
Wait, cross-dressing? Really?
Yes, he was very, very concerned about men dressing as women and women dressing as men. The overarching logic of the time was, we have perverted the natural order of things, so God has sent a terrifying scourge to chastise us and correct us.
But if you look at that view, the idea that this invasion is literally a punishment from God, that actually encourages passivity, doesn't it? Because if God is the one spanking you, you don't turn around and hit God back. You take the punishment, you bow your head, and you repent.
You've hit the nail on the head. And that perfectly explains the initial, complete lack of a coordinated military response from the West. For centuries, the primary response to the Islamic expansion was prayer, not war.
They were trying to fix their soul.
Right, they were trying to fix their souls, not the borders on the map.
So what changes then? Because we have this massive 400-year gap we talked about at the top of the show. The initial conquests happen in the 600s and 700s. But the First Crusade isn't called until 1095. That is a huge delay.
It is.
If this was just a simple counterattack, why on earth did they wait 4 centuries to launch it?
That is the million-dollar question. And the primary answer, according to the source material, is that the fundamental nature of the threat changed.
Enter the Turks.
Yes, the Seljuk Turks. We really have to distinguish between the early Arab conquests and the later Turkish conquests.
Okay, lay that out for us.
For a long time, under the Arab caliphates, like the Abbasids and the Fatimids things, had settled into a somewhat predictable status quo in the Middle East. It certainly wasn't great for Christians.
Right, they were a subjugated class.
They were second-class citizens. They had to pay a special heavy tax called the jizya. They were forbidden from ringing church bells or building new churches. But, and this is key, they were generally left alive to go about their business.
And Christian pilgrimage to the Holy Land was still allowed.
Oh, it was a huge business.
Right.
The Muslim Arab rulers weren't stupid. They knew that these European pilgrims brought a ton of gold with them, so you could pay a tax, get a travel permit, and go pray in Jerusalem.
It was essentially religious tourism, and everyone made money.
Yeah.
But then the Turks upset that entire apple cart.
Exactly. The Turks originally came from the east, from the harsh steppes of Central Asia. They were nomadic warriors who had eventually converted to Islam, and by the 11th century, they had effectively taken over the reins of power from the Arabs.
And their culture was very different.
Completely different. They were relatively recent converts, which often means they were far more zealous, and they came from a much more violent, aggressive, martial culture than the highly urbanized, settled Arabs of the time.
The source material explicitly points out that the Turks didn't care at all about the business of pilgrimage. They just saw infidels in their territory.
And they saw new territory to conquer. So in the mid-11th century, they just slam into the Byzantine Empire. They violently overrun Armenia and Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. The source highlights the fall of Ani, known as the City of 1001 Churches, which falls in 1064.
And the details of that specific sack are just gruesome.
They really are. The source describes it not just as a standard military conquest, but as a deliberate ritual humiliation of the Christian faith. It wasn't enough for the Turks to just kill the people. They felt they had to kill the symbols of the religion itself. They took these massive iron crosses down from the tops of the churches and actually sent them all the way back to Baghdad. And they did this specifically so the crosses could be embedded into the thresholds of the mosques, ensuring that every single Muslim entering for prayer would literally trample on the cross.
I mean, that is a very deliberate, very calculated provocation.
It's intense psychological warfare.
Yeah.
And then in that exact same year, 1064, you have what the source considers the real trigger event, the Great German Pilgrimage.
And we should clarify, this wasn't just a couple of guys with walking sticks and backpacks.
No, this was a massive undertaking. We are talking about anywhere from 7,000 to 12,000 people.
Yeah.
Led by high-ranking bishops, it was a massive organized movement of faith. And as they are moving through this newly conquered, highly unstable Turkish territory, they are ambushed.
And it's a slaughter.
It's an absolute massacre. Thousands are killed or sold into slavery. But there is one specific horrifying incident from that ambush that the source highlights because it really seemed to galvanize the European aristocracy.
Right.
There was a very high-ranking abbess traveling with the group.
And for context for the listener, an abbess is essentially the female equivalent of a bishop. A very powerful, highly respected, holy figure in the church.
Exactly. And the deeply traumatized survivors who made it back to Europe brought reports that she wasn't just killed during the ambush. She was repeatedly raped to death by the attackers.
That specific detail really seems to be the turning point for the European mindset.
It was their Pearl Harbor moment. When that specific news hit the royal courts of France and Germany, the entire mood shifted overnight. It was no longer, well, travel to the east is dangerous, it's God's will.
It became personal.
It became, they are defiling the literal brides of Christ. The centuries-old passivity of this is God's punishment for our sins was rapidly replaced by the fury of we have a moral duty to protect the innocent.
So right around this time, the Byzantine emperor, Alexios Komnenos, is sitting in Constantinople, watching his empire burn to the ground. He sees the Turks getting closer and closer to his capital. And he does something unprecedented. He swallows his pride because, let's remember, the Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholics weren't exactly friends at this point, and he writes a desperate letter to the Pope.
The message is basically, help us or we all die, and Christendom falls. That's the gist of the letter. And Pope Urban II receives this urgent plea and convenes the Council of Clermont in 1095.
And this is exactly where the Crusade is born. This is also where I think we hit the absolute biggest mental block for modern listeners.
Oh, without a doubt.
We live in a heavily secular, materialist world. We can completely understand fighting a war for oil or for land or to spread democracy, but fighting a massive, bloody war for religion. And specifically, a religion whose central figure literally said, love your enemies and turn the other cheek.
It seems like a glaring contradiction to us.
It seems like massive hypocrisy. How did they possibly square that circle? How do you intellectually go from the Sermon on the Mount to the Siege of Antioch?
To understand that, we have to take a deep dive into the medieval theology of violence, specifically the development of just war theory.
Which brings us right back to St. Augustine again.
Yes. Augustine heavily wrestled with this exact problem back in the 4th and 5th centuries. He looked at the Bible and he saw a very real tension. On one hand, Jesus says to turn the other cheek. But on the other hand, God in the Old Testament actively commands wars. And even in the New Testament, professional soldiers exist and they aren't ever told to quit their jobs.
The source brings up the story of the Roman centurion here, which I found really interesting.
It's a classic example they used. A centurion comes to Jesus asking for a healing. Now, a centurion is a professional, highly trained killer. That is literally his job description for the Roman Empire. Jesus actually marvels at this man's faith. He heals the centurion's servant. But, and this was huge for medieval thinkers, Jesus never once says to him, oh, by the way, your profession is inherently sinful. You need to resign your commission immediately.
Or the example of John the Baptist.
Right. Soldiers come up to John the Baptist and ask him straight out, what should we do to be righteous? He tells them, be content with your wages and do not extort money. He effectively tells them to be good, honest soldiers. He distinctly doesn't say, stop being a soldier.
So the medieval mind looked at all this and decided that the act of soldiering itself wasn't inherently sinful. It completely depended on the cause.
Exactly. Augustine argued that war is morally justified if and only if it meets 3 strict criteria. First, it must be officially declared by a legitimate authority like a king or a pope.
Okay.
Second, it must be for a definitively just cause. Usually that meant pure defense or the reclaiming of stolen property. And third, and this is by far the biggest one for the Crusaders, it must be motivated by right intention.
Right intention. That sounds a little vague. What does that actually mean in practice?
It means you aren't fighting because you secretly love violence or enjoy killing. You aren't fighting out of bloodlust or greed. You are fighting exclusively to protect the innocent. Augustine basically argued that if you see your neighbor being attacked or raped or enslaved, and you just stand there and do absolutely nothing because you want to keep your own hands spiritually clean, you are actively failing to love your neighbor.
Wow. So you are essentially an accomplice to the evil through your inaction.
Exactly. The source calls this the doormat Christian fallacy. The Crusaders were repeatedly told from the pulpits that fighting a brutal war to liberate the oppressed Christians of the East was actually an act of supreme love. It was framed as an act of selfless charity toward their persecuted brothers and sisters.
That is such a massive reframe for a modern audience. We usually think of the Crusades purely as an act of targeted hate against Muslims, but internally they viewed it as an act of profound love for fellow Christians.
And that precise logic brings us to the Two Swords Doctrine,
which is the title of the main book we are pulling from today. The Two Swords of Christ by Raymond Ibrahim.
Right. This concept comes directly from a highly specific scene in the Gospel of Luke, right before the arrest of Jesus in the garden. The disciples are nervous, and they say to Jesus, "Lord, look, here are two swords." And Jesus replies, "It is enough."
Now, if you ask most modern theologians about that passage, they usually say Jesus was being ironic or dismissive, like, okay, guys, that's enough of that kind of talk. Put the weapons away.
Sure. But the medieval exegesis, their formal theological interpretation, was entirely literal. They truly believed Jesus was explicitly establishing the power structure of Christendom in that moment. There are literally two swords given to the world. The spiritual sword, which belongs exclusively to the church, meaning prayer, the sacraments, the power of excommunication.
Right.
And then there is the secular sword, the physical sword, which belongs to the king and his knights.
And the entire purpose of the secular sword is to physically protect the church.
Exactly. They believe the church itself cannot shed blood. A priest cannot and must not hold a sword. But a knight absolutely must hold the sword to ensure that the priest can pray in peace without being slaughtered. They saw these two roles as completely symbiotic. You simply cannot have one without the other in a fallen, violent world.
This actually leads to what I think is the deepest philosophical point in the entire source material, the fundamental difference between materialism and metaphysics. Because I really think this is the master key to unlocking their entire headspace.
It really is. You and I, and everyone listening, we are all basically materialists.
Right.
And I don't mean we love shop at the mall, though we do. I mean that our fundamental, unquestioned worldview assumes that physical reality is the most important thing that exists. This physical life is all there is. Therefore, physical death is the ultimate evil. Physical pain is the ultimate bad.
So, preserving physical life and avoiding death is the highest possible good in our society.
Correct. But the medieval mind was intensely metaphysical. They genuinely believed that the physical world was just a temporary, fleeting testing ground. They called it a vale of tears.
Right.
The real life, the only life that actually mattered, was the eternal one after death. The soul was infinitely more valuable than the biological body.
So, logically, if I kill your body, I haven't actually done the worst thing possible to you?
Right. Because your soul goes to God. But if I allow you to be spiritually corrupted by heresy, or if I allow a supremely holy place where Christ walked to be physically desecrated, that is a catastrophic spiritual disaster that damages the soul. This is exactly why these knights could be so incredibly fearless in battle. A Crusader knight wasn't out there trying to desperately preserve his biological life at all costs. He was actively trying to preserve his eternal soul.
And dying in a crusade, dying in officially sanctioned holy war, was seen as a way to completely fast-track that salvation.
It was viewed as the ultimate penance, the ultimate sacrifice of love.
Okay, so let's recap where we are. We have the broader context, 400 years of Christians losing massive amounts of territory.
Right.
We have the immediate trigger, the arrival of the Turks and the horrifying atrocities against pilgrims.
Right.
We have the cultural software installed, just war theory and the two swords doctrine. So now, we finally get to the hardware, the First Crusade itself.
1095. Pope Urban II gives his famous speech at Clermont, and the massive crowd just erupts. They start chanting, Deus Vult, God wills it.
But it wasn't just one unified, highly disciplined army that marched out of Europe, was it?
No, not at all. And this is a really crucial distinction that often gets blurred. There were actually two completely distinct waves to the First Crusade. The first wave is what historians call the People's Crusade.
Which was basically the rabble.
It was made up of peasants, excited children, the elderly local criminals looking for a fresh start. They were whipped into a frenzy by rogue, charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit. They had absolutely no supplies, zero military discipline, and honestly no clue what they were actually doing. They just packed up their meager belongings and started walking east.
And we have to talk about this because these are the exact groups who committed those horrific pogroms against Jewish communities in Europe before they even left the continent.
Yes. This is an incredibly dark chapter of the period, as this massive, uncontrolled mob marched eastward through the Rhineland in modern-day Germany. They violently attacked established Jewish communities. Their twisted logic was essentially, why should we march 3,000 miles to fight the enemies of Christ in the East when there are, quote-unquote, enemies of Christ right here in our own backyard?
It's completely horrific.
Yeah.
But the source material is very careful to point out the official church's reaction to this, which we need to be clear about.
We do. The official church hierarchy completely and totally condemned these attacks. The local Catholic bishops in these German cities actually went to great lengths to try and protect the Jewish populations from the mob. They physically opened up their own fortified episcopal palaces and gave the Jews sanctuary inside. The People's Crusade was entirely a rogue populist mob acting in direct defiance of the explicit orders of the church.
And what actually happened to this peasant mob when they finally exhausted themselves and reached the actual Turkish armies?
They were annihilated, literally wiped out. They crossed over into Asia Minor. The highly trained Turkish cavalry rode out to meet them, and it was entirely over in a single afternoon. The peasants were just slaughtered or enslaved.
And then after that disaster comes the second wave, the Prince's Crusade.
Now, these are the actual professionals. Men like Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse.
The heavy hitters?
Exactly. These armies had heavily armored knights, trained siege engineers, baggage trains, complex logistics. This was a real military operation.
Now, I want to pause here and bust a really persistent myth, the second son's myth.
Yeah.
Because I was definitely taught this in high school, and I know a lot of our listeners were too.
Oh, it's everywhere.
The idea is that under strict European feudal law, the oldest son inherits the entire estate. He gets the castle, the land, everything. So all the younger brothers, the second and third sons, they're basically broke and bored. So they eagerly sign up for the crusade just to go carve out a new kingdom for themselves and get rich in the East.
It's a very neat, very cynical, highly modern economic interpretation of history. And the source material argues quite forcefully that it is completely false.
Why is it false? It sounds plausible.
Because going on a crusade was an act of near-certain financial suicide. It was astronomically expensive. To properly equip just one single knight, we're talking custom armor, multiple trained war horses because they die on the road, squires to assist him, and enough food for a multi-year journey into hostile territory that cost roughly 4 to 5 times a noble's entire annual income.
Oh, wow. So they weren't going out there expecting to get rich. They were literally going broke just to buy the ticket.
Exactly. We actually have the surviving property records from the era. We can see these high-ranking nobles desperately selling off their ancestral land, heavily mortgaging their castles directly to the church, and quickly settling old, lingering lawsuits at a loss, all just to raise liquid cash. They were completely liquidating their generational assets.
And why would a purely greedy, economically motivated person ever do that?
They wouldn't. A greedy person stays home and guards his gold. A pious person, deeply terrified of the fires of hell, does that. They believed the Pope's central promise that completing the crusade was a plenary indulgence.
Which means what?
It means a complete remission of the temporal punishment for their past sins. They were quite literally bankrupting themselves to buy their way out of purgatory. They weren't trying to buy a sunny summer home in Beirut.
That makes so much more sense when you look at the economics. So this massive, well-equipped army marches. And the journey is just brutal. Widespread starvation, terrible disease outbreaks. But against literally all the geopolitical odds, they actually make it. They successfully lay siege to Antioch. And finally, in 1099, they take Jerusalem.
The famous siege of Jerusalem.
And here we really have to address the violence head-on. Because when the Crusaders finally breached the walls and took the city, it wasn't a peaceful transition of power.
No, not at all. It was an absolute bloodbath. The contemporary sources describe the horror in vivid detail, saying the horses waded in blood up to their knees. The Crusaders slaughtered the defending Muslim garrison, and tragically, they also slaughtered the local Jewish population who had desperately taken refuge inside their main synagogue.
And the source material doesn't shy away from this or deny it happened.
Yeah.
But it does heavily contextualize it.
Right. The author argues that we fundamentally cannot look at the events of 1099 wearing our 2026 moral glasses. In the strict, universally accepted medieval rules of war, there was a very clear binary.
How did it work?
If a besieged city voluntarily surrendered before the walls were breached, the lives and property of the inhabitants were generally spared. But if a city stubbornly resisted, forced a long, bloody siege, and had to be taken by violent storm, the lives of every single person inside were legally considered forfeit.
It was just the standard operating procedure of the era.
Exactly. The Romans did it for centuries, the massive Muslim armies did it, the Mongols did it on an even larger scale, the Crusaders were simply operating within the brutally violent norms of their specific century. It absolutely doesn't make it good or moral to us, but it means it wasn't some unique, unprecedented European evil. It was just how war was fought.
So, they take the city, they fulfill their vows, they establish the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but almost immediately they run into a massive logistical problem.
A completely existential one. You have to remember, the First Crusade was ultimately a religious pilgrimage. Once that sacred vow was technically fulfilled, Once a knight finally knelt and prayed at the Holy Sepulchre, most of these guys just dusted off their knees and said, okay, great, my soul is clean, I'm going home to France.
Money, I'm back from the Holy War.
Pretty much. So this massive victorious army almost instantly dissolves, and you are suddenly left with this tiny, isolated handful of European Franks trying to rule over a massive, deeply hostile local population entirely surrounded by powerful enemies in Egypt and Damascus.
And the physical roads connecting these places are still incredibly dangerous.
Deadly. European pilgrims are still arriving by the thousands at the coastal ports like Jaffa. But in that short stretch between the port and Jerusalem, they are constantly getting ambushed.
By who?
Local bandits, highly mobile Bedouin raiders, leftover Turkish cavalry patrols. The pilgrims are being routinely robbed, killed, or dragged off to be sold in slave markets.
And this specific, terrifying security vacuum is what creates the most unique, famous innovation of the entire Crusades. The warrior monks.
Yes.
The military orders.
Let's start with the most famous ones, the Templars. Officially, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ.
They were founded right around 1119, and it's amazing because it started with literally just 9 knights, 9 guys. Their entire original mission was incredibly simple. Police the dangerous highway, escort the unarmed pilgrims safely from the coast to the city.
But the catch is, they were also formerly monks.
And this was the deeply radical part. Usually medieval society was strictly divided into 3 distinct orders. Those who pray, meaning the monks, those who fight, meaning the secular knights, and those who work, the peasants.
Right.
The Templars forcefully smashed the first 2 categories completely together. They took the strict monastic vows of poverty, absolute chastity, and total obedience. They lived communally, they chanted the daily prayers. But their specific form of service to God was physical violence. And St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who was basically the biggest, most influential public intellectual of the day, he absolutely loved this concept.
Oh, he essentially wrote their global marketing material. He penned a famous treatise called In Praise of the New Knighthood. He systematically argued that a Templar isn't a murderer because he kills evil, not men. He intellectually legitimized the entire concept for the European elite.
And they were physically based right on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
Yes, specifically in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders mistakenly thought was the ruins of King Solomon's original temple. That's exactly why we call them the Templars.
Now, the other major group, the Hospitalers, the Order of St. John, I personally find their story even more fascinating because they didn't actually start out as fighters at all.
No, they didn't. Their roots go way back, even before the First Crusade was called. They were originally a dedicated hospice order, a hospital. Their sole job was to carefully nurse the sick and dying pilgrims who arrived in Jerusalem.
They were basically combat medics or nurses.
And they took this duty incredibly seriously. Their formal rule explicitly stated that any sick person who came to them was to be treated as the Lord himself, and the attending knight was merely the serf.
Wow. That is a complete inversion of the medieval social hierarchy.
A radical inversion. They would literally serve the sick peasants their meals on solid silver platters. They would give the sick patients the absolute best feather beds, while the aristocratic brothers of the order slept on the hard stone floor. If a poor, destitute peasant came in covered in sores, a high-born European nobleman would kneel down and wash his feet.
So how on earth do these incredibly tender, devoted nurses morph into the elite Green Berets of the Middle East?
Pure necessity. As the security situation deteriorated, they eventually realized, well, it's really great that we are patiently bandaging all these wounded pilgrims, but maybe it would be even better if you physically stopped them from getting stabbed in the first place.
Preventative medicine.
Preventative medicine with broadswords. They slowly militarized. But crucially, they never abandoned their core hospice function. So you ended up with this incredibly jarring dual identity within the same men.
What did that look like?
A hospitaller knight would literally spend his entire morning gently feeding a dying leper with a wooden spoon, and then spend his afternoon leading a devastating heavy cavalry charge against Saladin's elite guard.
That psychological switch must have been just incredibly intense to manage.
But it was highly effective. Over time, these military orders effectively became the permanent standing army of the Crusader states. Because they had taken lifelong vows, they didn't pack up and go home to Europe after a year. They permanently manned the massive border castles like the really famous Crc des Chevaliers in Syria. That was entirely a hospitaller stronghold.
And the Muslim armies actively feared them more than anyone else on the battlefield.
Absolutely. The source makes a big point of this. If a regular, secular European knight was captured in battle, Saladin might hold him for a hefty ransom. It was just a standard business transaction between nobles. But if a Templar or a Hospitaller was captured,
Very different story.
very different. Often they were immediately executed right on the spot because Saladin knew these specific men were absolute true believers. They could not be bought, they would never surrender, and they would never, ever stop fighting.
So for almost an entire century, these dedicated orders successfully hold the line. But eventually, the geopolitical tide turns against them. The Muslim world, which had been deeply fractured and fighting amongst itself during the First Crusade, slowly starts to unify.
Right, you get the rise of strong leaders like Zengi, then Nur ad-Din, and finally the most famous of all, Saladin. And that Muslim unity was the ultimate death knell for the isolated Crusader states.
In 1187, you have the massive disaster at the Battle of Hattin.
It was a total catastrophe. The main Crusader field army is foolishly lured out into the scorching desert. They are strategically cut off from all water sources, and they are completely wiped out by Saladin. And without that army to defend it, Jerusalem finally falls back into Muslim hands.
And the shocking news of the fall of Jerusalem is what directly triggers the Third Crusade. Which brings us to Richard the Lionheart.
The absolute rock star of the Middle Ages.
And militarily, according to the deep dive sources, he was genuinely brilliant.
He was a tactical and logistical genius. He marches in, he reconquers the vital coastal cities, he successfully takes back the massive fortress of Acre. He single-handedly saves the Crusader kingdom from total permanent extinction.
But
He couldn't retake Jerusalem itself. And more importantly, he was smart enough to realize that even if he did manage to storm the walls, he didn't have the manpower to hold it long term. So, being a pragmatist, he negotiated a working truce with Saladin that allowed unarmed pilgrims to visit, and then he went home to England.
which eventually sets the stage for the Fourth Crusade. And we really need to spend some time here, because this is the specific event that critics always point to. This is their big aha moment. See, look at this. It was never actually about religion at all. It was always just naked greed.
And honestly, the Fourth Crusade is an absolute tragedy of errors. It originally launched in 1202. The grand strategic plan was actually to sail down and attack Egypt, to hit the Muslim power base where it was strongest. But to move an army that size across the Mediterranean, they desperately needed a massive fleet of ships.
Now, they go to the Venetians to hire them.
Right, and the Venetians are, well, they are extremely practical people.
They are hardcore capitalists.
Exactly. When the Crusader army finally gathers in Venice, they realize they don't have nearly enough money to pay the enormous fare they agreed to. So the Doge of Venice says, well, tell you what, there's a wealthy rival port city right across the water called Zara. They are currently rebelling against our trade dominance. If you use your army to help us besiege and sack Zara, we'll defer your debt.
But Zara was a completely Christian city.
Yes. It belonged to the Catholic king of Hungary, who had actually taken a crusader vow himself. When the Pope found out what they were doing, he was absolutely furious.
I bet.
He immediately excommunicated the entire Crusader army. He sent letters essentially screaming, "You are fighting the wrong people, turn around."
But it somehow gets even worse from there.
It does. Through a ridiculously complex series of political machinations involving a deposed, exiled Byzantine prince who promised the Crusaders vast sums of money he didn't actually have, the entire Crusader fleet is diverted away from Egypt and sails right to Constantinople.
The ancient capital of Eastern Christianity.
Yeah.
The very people who asked for help back in 1095.
Exactly. And in 1204, unable to get the money they were promised, the Crusaders violently sacked the city. They ruthlessly looted the ancient churches. They destroyed priceless art. They melted down relics. And they set up a short-lived puppet government called the Latin Empire. It was a complete fratricidal disaster.
So, does this horrific event finally prove the modern greed narrative? Does it prove it was all a scam?
Well, it certainly proves that human beings are deeply corruptible. But the source material heavily emphasizes a key point here. This was entirely a rogue crusade. It was explicitly and repeatedly condemned by the head of the church. It wasn't the intended plan. It was a catastrophic breakdown of the plan caused by debt and political opportunism.
But the damage was done. It fatally weakened Byzantium.
It broke the empire's back permanently. And ironically, that crippling weakness is exactly what eventually opened the door for the Ottoman Turks to fully conquer the city a few centuries later.
So, back down the Holy Land, the remaining Crusader states are just living on borrowed time. Slowly, year by year, the coastal cities fall, until we reach the year 1291.
The devastating siege of Acre, the final act of the play. The Mamluks, who now rule Egypt, march up with a massive, unstoppable army. The last remaining Templars and Hospitallers fight incredibly bravely on the crumbling walls. The Grand Master of the Templars is killed in the desperate street fighting. Eventually, the city completely falls. The European mainland presence in the Middle East is officially lost.
Game over.
Well, for the physical kingdom of Jerusalem, yes. But the source makes a really fascinating point right here that surprised me. The crusade itself doesn't actually end in 1291. It just fundamentally changes terrain. It moves to the sea.
The naval afterlife of the Crusades.
Yes, specifically the ongoing story of the Hospitallers. Refusing to disband, they strategically retreat to the island of Cyprus. Then they manage to conquer the heavily fortified island of Rhodes. And over decades, they completely transform themselves from a heavy cavalry force into an elite naval power.
Wait, so they became pirate monks?
Basically, yes. Corsair monks. For over 200 years, they actively operate out of Rhodes. Their heavily armed galleys constantly patrol the Mediterranean, aggressively attacking Ottoman shipping lanes, fighting off Muslim pirates, and severely disrupting the vital supply lines of the expanding Islamic empires. They were a massive, constant thorn in the side of the Ottoman sultans.
And eventually they are forced to move their base of operations to Malta.
Right, where they famously withstand the Great Siege of Malta in 1565. A tiny, vastly outnumbered force of knights somehow holding off the absolute full military might of the entire Ottoman Empire. It genuinely ranks as one of the greatest, most dramatic last stands in all of military history.
Now, this exact era connects to a part of the source material that I have to admit genuinely shocked me. The Barbary Corsairs.
Oh, yeah.
Because this is a massive piece of global history that feels like it has been completely erased from our collective hard drive. We never talk about it.
It really has been forgotten. When you and I think of the word slavery in the early modern period, we instinctively only think of the horrific transatlantic slave trade.
Right.
But there was simultaneously another massive, brutally industrial slave trade happening in the exact opposite direction.
We're talking about pirates from North Africa, from the Barbary Coast, aggressively raiding Europe.
And they weren't just attacking merchant ships at sea. They were systematically raiding the land itself. These corsairs would sail up, land on the undefended coasts of Italy, Spain, southern France. They would quietly surround a whole fishing village in the dead of night, drag absolutely everyone out of their beds, men, women, children, priests, and haul them all back in chains to the slave markets of Algiers or Tunis or Tripoli to be sold.
And this wasn't some rare, isolated occurrence.
It was constant. It was a relentless terror. Whole massive stretches of the beautiful Italian and Spanish coastlines were completely abandoned by the population. People literally moved miles inland into the hills because it simply wasn't safe to live near the sea anymore.
And they didn't just stay in the Mediterranean.
No, they got incredibly bold. They raided as far north as England, Ireland, and incredibly, even Iceland.
Wait, Iceland? Actually, Iceland.
Yes. The historical records call them the Turkish abductions in Iceland. North African pirates sailed all the way to the Arctic Circle just to capture blonde-haired slaves because they fetched a premium price in the markets.
What are the total numbers on this trade? Because it sounds massive.
The source cites very reliable, peer-reviewed historical estimates that between the 16th and 18th centuries, well over 1 million Europeans were captured and enslaved by these North African corsairs.
Over 1 million people. That is just staggering to comprehend.
It is. And the crazy thing is, it's deeply embedded in our classic literature. We just don't notice it. Take Robinson Crusoe, arguably the most famous English adventure novel ever written.
Right.
Do you remember how that story actually starts? Before he ever gets shipwrecked on the famous island.
Honestly, no. I just remember the island and the volleyball. Wait, no, that's the movie Castaway.
Right, wrong story. In the actual novel, young Robinson Crusoe is captured at sea. He is taken by what Defoe calls the Salé rovers, which were real Barbary pirates from Morocco. Crusoe literally spends 2 miserable years as a captive slave in North Africa before he manages to escape. When Daniel Defoe wrote that in 1719, he didn't have to explain the context to his readers. They all intimately knew about it. It was a completely common, everyday fear for anyone near the ocean.
And the Hospitallers, the Knights of St. John in Malta, they were the primary ones fighting back against this.
Exactly. For centuries, the Knights of Malta effectively acted as the road police force of the Mediterranean. They were the ones constantly intercepting these corsair slave galleys and freeing the captives. So if you look at it through that specific lens in a very real, tangible way, the religious war that officially started with Pope Urban in 1095 didn't actually end until the 19th century. century.
Why the 19th century specifically? What finally stopped it?
Because that's finally when the newly formed U.S. Navy and eventually the British Royal Navy sailed down, heavily bombarded the Barbary ports, and militarily forced the rulers to permanently stop the slave raiding. If you know the Marine Corps hymn, the line that goes, "To the shores of Tripoli."
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That exact lyric is about the U.S. Marines fighting the Muslim corsairs to stop the enslavement of American sailors. It's basically the Crusades, Part 9.
That is just mind-blowing context. So
For sure.
let's zoom out here as we wrap up. We've done the deep dive. We've gone from the 7th century all the way to the 19th. How do we ultimately analyze this? Was the entire crusading project a failure?
Well, if you only look at the physical map of the Middle East, yes, it was a failure. They desperately wanted to keep Jerusalem fully Christian. They failed to do that. They wanted to permanently push back the borders of Islam. But Islam eventually completely swallowed Constantinople, and their armies marched all the way to the gates of Vienna in Central Europe.
But the source material strongly argues for a different metric, a strategic victory.
Right. You have to really think about the massive timeline we just covered. The Crusaders successfully held the Levant for 200 crucial years. Then they held the naval strongholds of Rhodes and Malta for another few centuries after that. That is roughly 500 years, where the massively powerful Islamic empires were forced to focus immense military resources on their own backyard.
It acted like a giant civilizational breakwater.
It was a massive, bloody, delaying action. The source strongly argues that the Crusades effectively bought Europe the crucial time it needed to survive. While the mighty Ottoman sultans were burning through fortunes and armies trying to dig the Knights of St. John out of their fortresses, Europe was safely developing the Renaissance. They were inventing the printing press, they were launching the Age of Exploration. So by the time the Ottomans were finally secure enough to seriously push up into Central Europe again, the West had completely surpassed them technologically and militarily.
So what you're saying is, without the massive distraction of the Crusades, the apocalyptic siege of Vienna might have happened in, say, 1200 instead of 1683.
Exactly. And if it happened in 1200, when Europe was still divided and weak, the historical result might have been very, very different. Europe might have fallen completely.
Now, there's one more major historical controversy we definitely need to briefly touch on from the outline. The concept of the Golden Age of Islam.
Right. This is a very sensitive topic, but it's central to Ibrahim's thesis. The standard, widely accepted historical narrative today is basically this. During the Middle Ages, Christian Europe was wallowing in the Dark Ages, violently living in mud huts and burning witches.
Sure.
Meanwhile, the Islamic world was experiencing this glorious golden age of tolerance, inventing complex algebra, advancing chemistry, and preserving and translating the lost works of Aristotle.
And the unstated implication of that narrative is usually Islam was inherently enlightened and scientific, while Christianity was inherently backward and violent.
Exactly. But Raymond Ibrahim pushes back on this narrative very, very hard in the source material. He argues that while it is undeniable that these massive scientific and cultural achievements occurred chronologically under Islamic political rule, they were not necessarily born of the Islamic religion itself.
What's the specific distinction he's making there?
He specifically points out that the vast majority of the actual scholars, the brilliant architects, and the pioneering scientists working during this period were actually drawn directly from the recently conquered populations.
Oh, I see.
They were ethnic Persians, Greek-speaking Byzantines, local Jews, and Syriac Christians who had been violently absorbed into the expanding caliphate.
So his argument is that the complex bureaucracy, the stunning architecture, the math, it was really just the lingering momentum of the older, highly advanced civilizations they had just conquered?
That is exactly his thesis. He argues that the Arab armies conquered these incredibly advanced ancient societies like Sassanid Persia and Hellenistic Egypt, and they simply appropriated their vast intellectual capital. So in his view, it wasn't that the new religion miraculously produced the advanced science. It was simply that the new military empire highly taxed the existing scientists.
And the source also suggests that this specific Golden Age narrative is often used for modern political purposes today.
Yes. The author believes it is frequently deployed to argue that the current religious violence we sometimes see, like modern terrorism or radical jihadism, is a complete historical aberration. The narrative essentially says, look at how uniquely peaceful and scientific they used to be. Therefore, this modern violence is just a temporary political glitch.
Whereas Ibrahim looks at the exact same history and sees unbroken continuity.
He sees a perfectly straight historical line. From the explosive 7th century military conquests, right through to the brutal destruction of the 1001 churches in Anatolia, to the massive Barbary slave trade, all the way down to modern militant groups like Hezbollah today.
And it is true that Hezbollah still heavily uses that medieval imagery in their rhetoric, don't they?
They absolutely do. In their official speeches, in their recruiting propaganda, they constantly talk about fighting the Crusaders and the Zionists. For them, this history isn't some dusty textbook from the past. For them, the 11th century was yesterday. It is an ongoing, active war.
So bringing it all together, where does this incredibly deep dive leave us? We've systematically stripped away the simplistic unprovoked aggression myth. We've looked closely at the complex theology of the two swords. We've seen the astonishing bravery of the knights, and we've confronted the undeniable brutality of the sieges.
I really think it leaves us with a profound need for historical empathy. And to be clear, I don't mean sympathy. You certainly don't have to like or excuse what they did, but true empathy means doing the hard work of understanding exactly why they believed they had to do it.
Right. They weren't just cartoon villains twirling their mustaches looking to oppress people for fun.
And they certainly weren't flawless cartoon heroes in shining armor either. They were deeply terrified, flawed people living in a brutal world that felt like it was violently collapsing all around them, and they were entirely motivated by a rigid belief system that explicitly told them the eternal soul was vastly more important than the biological body.
They were responding to a massive, terrifying geopolitical vacuum.
And they filled that terrifying vacuum with literally the only tools they had available to them in that era: unshakable faith and cold steel.
I want to leave the listener with one final provocative thought to mull over, specifically regarding this modern concept of safetyism. Because we live in a modern Western world where physical safety is basically our highest functioning god. We mandate seatbelts, we obsessively fear germs, we try to aggressively engineer all risk out of our lives. We are materialists par excellence.
We really are. We genuinely cannot even imagine willingly sacrificing our physical body for an abstract spiritual idea. It computes a sheer madness to us.
Right, so if the Crusades were fundamentally a desperate response to a massive civilizational threat, a sprawling aggressive empire that successfully enslaved millions and conquered half the known world, does our extreme modern comfort actually blind us to historical reality?
That is a great question. Does our absolute obsession with personal safety make us intellectually incapable of recognizing when the wolves are actually gathering at the door?
Or does it just make us securely look back at the terrifying logic of the two swords and immediately see religious madness when the people actually living through the nightmare simply saw the only path to survival?
That really is the ultimate question of this era. The complex, bloody history is all there in the ground. We just have to be intellectually brave enough to actually dig it up and look at it honestly.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.
See you next time.